The great hall of Ashwick Manor held 30 candles and 30 people, and every one of them turned when the footman opened the side door and Clara Vane walked in. She had not come for dinner. She had come because the Earl of Ashwick had sent for her. And when an earl sends for a woman in your position, you come. Her hands were clean. She had scrubbed them twice in the scullery basin and dried them on the good cloth she kept folded in her work bag, because her hands were all she had to recommend her, and she would not let them carry the evidence of the day's work into a room like this one. The room was candlelight and crystal, the long table set with silver that caught the light and threw it back in fractured pieces. Lady Georgiana Peel sat at the Earl's right hand, her gown the precise blue of a winter sky, her neck ringed with pearls that would have fed a village for a season. The Dowager Countess, Lady Dorothea Ashwick, sat at the head of the opposite end, a position she had not technically been invited to vacate in 30 years, and she did not move now. Edmund Ashwick, Earl of Ashwick, stood at the fireplace. He had his back to it, which meant the light was behind him, and his face was in shadow. And Clara thought that was not an accident. He had his father's bearing, they said in the village, and his grandfather's stubbornness, and neither ancestor was alive to dispute the characterization. He was 36 years old, and wore his reserve the way other men wore their rank, as a thing that could not be removed in polite company. He looked at Clara when she entered. He had the kind of eyes that did not move when they landed on something, and they did not move now. They held her at the threshold for a full count of 10, during which the table's conversation thinned to silence and then died entirely. And then he said, very quietly, "Miss Vane, thank you for coming." The Dowager's fan paused at the exact height it had been raised to. Then it resumed its arc, slow and deliberate, as though the pause had not occurred. Clara had first arrived at Ashwick Manor 6 weeks earlier, in the last week of October, with her work bag over one arm and a letter of introduction from the linen draper in the village, who had told her the estate was seeking someone with knowledge of heraldic embroidery. She had such knowledge. Her father had been a craftsman and a scholar of it, a man who kept illuminated manuscript copies of heraldic rolls in a tin chest under his bed, and had taught his daughter to read them the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture. He had died 2 winters ago, and Clara had taken the tin chest and her needles and her understanding of blazon and tincture, and had made of them what living she could. The commission at Ashwick was significant. The great heraldic embroidery that hung above the main staircase, nearly 4 feet by 6, had deteriorated in the upper left quadrant where damp had come in through the roof 30 years past. The rot had been arrested, the roof repaired, but the embroidery had never been properly restored. The steward, a careful man named Hobbs, had written in his letter that they required someone who could work with the existing threads and match the original colors exactly, repairing only what was damaged, never imposing. Clara had read those words and felt something settle in her chest. Never imposing. She knew how to be that. She had arrived by the back entrance, as was correct, and been shown to a small room off the kitchen passage where she could sleep and work, and Mrs. Tully, the housekeeper, had brought her tea and looked at her with the assessing kindness of a woman who had spent 40 years watching young women arrive at houses where they were not quite welcome. "You'll find his lordship takes his meals early, and his silence is long," Mrs. Tully had said, setting down the cup. "Don't take either personally." Clara had not intended to take anything personally. She had come to restore an embroidery. She had begun on the 2nd morning, with the embroidery down from the wall and laid on the long work table in the room they had cleared for her at the end of the gallery. The damage was worse than the letter had suggested, which was not unusual. People who commission restoration of valuable things are often unable to look directly at how much has been lost, and so they describe the minimum and hope for a miracle. Clara did not believe in miracles. She believed in good light and a fine needle, and the patience to unpick what had been done wrong before attempting anything new. It was the unpicking that found it. She had been working at the damaged quadrant for 3 days, carefully releasing the stitches that had been placed over the original work by some previous hand, not a restorer's hand, but a concealing one, when the underlayer emerged. It came up slowly, as things that have been buried always do, a thread at a time, and Clara sat back on her stool and held her candle closer and looked at what was there. The current crest of the earldom of Ashwick displayed a gold falcon on a field of red, with the motto Justice and Constancy in Roman letters along the base. She had memorized it before arriving because that was how she worked, learning the original so thoroughly that any deviation would be immediately apparent. What lay beneath the false overlay was not a falcon. It was a lark, a silver lark on a field of blue, with a different motto entirely, one she recognized from the heraldic rolls in her father's tin chest, belonging to a family named Vane. Her own name. Her own father's name. She sat very still for what felt like a long time. The candle burned, the threads lay in their basket, the false gold and the true silver together, and she thought about what it meant that someone had placed one over the other and called the false one real. She had known the Vane family had once held something. Her father had spoken of it rarely, and with the careful distance of a man who had made his peace with a loss he could not prove. The earldom, he had once said, when he was feverish, and thought she was asleep. The earldom was ours, before it was theirs. There had been no documents, no proof, only an old man's whisper and a tin chest full of manuscripts. And now, there was this. She folded her hands in her lap and thought about what a woman in her position could do with a finding like this one. She could say nothing. She could restore the false stitching and leave at the end of her commission and carry the knowledge home the way her father had carried it, in silence. She could go to the dowager. She could go to the earl. She did neither that night. Instead, she took a sheet of paper from her work bag, the thin kind she used for tracing patterns, and she laid it over the original blazon and traced it in pencil, every charge and tincture, the lark's wing and the field's color, and the motto's full text. She folded the paper and put it in the inner pocket of her work bag beneath the spare needles. Then she took out her finest thread and went back to work. If there are readers among you who have ever held a secret that was not yours and not quite someone else's either, you will know something of what the next 2 weeks cost her. If you are new to this story, stay close. The accounting is coming. She said nothing to Mrs. Tully. She worked each day at the embroidery, carefully, making the visible restoration perfect, while the knowledge of the underlayer sat in her chest like a stone she could not set down. She watched the house. She watched who came and went. She watched the dowager pass the gallery door each morning at 11, pausing to look in, her gaze moving over Clara and the embroidery together, assessing both for compliance. It was on the 6th day of this watching that she became aware the Earl was watching in return. She did not hear him enter. She heard nothing, in fact, which was how she knew something had changed. Because the house had its sounds, the clocks and the footsteps, and the wind in the sash window, and all of them stopped at once the way sounds do when a large and careful man enters a room and holds himself very still. She kept working. Her needle moved. "You work at first light," he said. His voice was even, unhurried. "Not a question." "The light is best then," she said. He crossed to the window and stood looking out at the November garden, his hands clasped behind him, and she thought he was going to say something about the commission, about the timeline or the budget or the specific hue of the thread she was matching. He did not. He stood in silence for perhaps 3 minutes, which is a long time to stand in silence in a room with a stranger. And then he said, "My mother hired you." "Yes, my lord." "Not Hobbs." She paused, one beat. "The letter came from Mr. Hobbs." "The instruction did not." She looked up then, which she had not done since he entered, and found him turned from the window and looking at her directly, with the same quality of attention she had felt the night he sent for her at dinner. It was not the attention of a man who dismissed what he saw. It was the attention of a man who had trained himself not to show what he thought of what he saw, and was finding that discipline more effortful than usual. Her pulse noted this without her permission. "The work is good," he said finally. She nodded once and returned to her needle, and he left without speaking again, and she sat for a moment in the silence he had left behind and pressed her free hand flat against the work table until the trembling stopped. The dowager came to Clara's workroom 2 days later. She arrived without announcement, which was her habit with the domestic staff, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, surveying the room with the composed authority of a woman who had been mistress of this house for most of her adult life. Clara rose and curtsied, as was required. "You are progressing well," Lady Dorothea said. Her voice was pleasant. It had the particular pleasantness of a voice that has never had to raise itself to achieve compliance. "I hope so, my lady." The dowager's gaze moved over the embroidery on the table, the basket of thread, the careful tools laid out in their order. It was a gaze that catalogued without appearing to. Clara kept her hands quiet. "My son seems to have found a professional interest in the restoration," the dowager said, her tone mild as milk. "It is kind of you to indulge his curiosity." "His lordship has asked several questions about the technique," Clara said. "I have answered them." "A needlewoman of your standing should know," the dowager said, addressing the far wall rather than Clara, as though she were speaking to the house itself, "that the Ashwick embroideries are a private family matter. Whatever one finds in the course of restoration remains, naturally, within the scope of the commission." She paused. "Confidentiality is a professional virtue." Clara met her eyes. "I have always thought so, my lady." The dowager held the look for one breath longer than was comfortable, and then she turned and left. And Clara stood in the now empty room and understood that she had just been warned. She went to see Mrs. Tully that evening, on the pretext of returning a borrowed shawl, and found the housekeeper alone in her sitting room with her knitting and a small fire. "How long have you been at Ashwick?" Clara asked when the tea was poured. Mrs. Tully considered the question with the care she gave everything. 42 years. "You knew the late Earl." "I did." A pause, the needles moving. He was a man who carried more than he should have. It was visible in him in the last years. A weight he could not set down. Clara watched the fire. "And Lady Dorothea?" Mrs. Tully did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was very quiet as the click of the needles. "Lady Dorothea has always known exactly what this house is built upon. That is her greatest strength and her worst one." Clara went back to her room and took out the folded traced paper from beneath the needles and sat with it in her lap for a long time. It was a Thursday morning, the day he came to the gallery at dawn, and found her at the table with her candle and 2 pieces of work laid side by side, and stopped in the doorway, and did not announce himself. She had the original underlayer exposed in the left quadrant, carefully freed and held flat with silk pins, and the traced paper open beside it, and the heraldic roll from her father's tin chest open at the page for the Vane blazon, and she was comparing all 3. Her hands were trembling. She had not slept. The weight of what she knew and what she could not prove and what she could not afford to lose had settled in the night into something very like grief, and she wept once, briefly, over the silver lark, and then she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and steadied herself, and went back to work. She did not hear him at the doorway. The gallery was cold at that hour, the fire not yet lit, and she had wrapped her shawl twice around her shoulders and positioned her candle close enough to the work that its warmth reached her fingers when she held them above the flame for a moment between stitches. The light at the east window had just begun to change, that particular gradation from black to dark blue that precedes the first suggestion of morning, and she had been watching it without meaning to, the way you watch a door you are not sure will open. She did not know he was there until she turned to reach for the magnifying glass and found him standing very still in the early light, his coat not yet on, his cravat not yet dressed. The particular unguardedness of a man who has come upon something before the day has given him his armor. He was looking at the 3 documents laid out on the table. She did not speak. Neither did he. The candle between them held its small, steady flame, and the window behind her went on brightening by degrees, and she watched him look at the evidence of 30 years of concealment spread across a work table, and understood that he had known this morning would come eventually, and had not expected it to come like this, in a room barely larger than a closet, with a seamstress as his witness. She had left everything visible. She had stopped pretending. His face was difficult to read at the best of times, and at dawn in the gallery it was harder still, but she watched the understanding move through him the way weather moves across a flat landscape, slow and then all at once. His eyes went from the underlayer to the traced paper to the roll, and back to her face, and she saw the moment the thing landed. He said nothing. His jaw set, and she thought she understood what it cost him. All the years of cold devotion to a name that was not entirely his, all the restraint and sacrifice, and the father he had promised on his deathbed to honor the family, and what honor meant now. "Your father told you," she said, not a question. He did not answer for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "He told me there had been a dispute, generations ago, that the matter had been settled." His voice was level. It was the most controlled voice she had ever heard. "The matter was not settled," Clara said. "It was buried." He looked at the silver lark on the original canvas, and something in his face fractured. A hairline break, like ice over a river that has held the winter and now holds 1 degree less of cold than is necessary. And he turned and walked out of the gallery, and the door did not close loudly, because it was not in his nature to make doors close loudly. And Clara sat in the silence he had left, and held the folded paper against her chest, and waited. She did not see Edmund that day, or the day after. The house continued its routines around her absence from his notice, the breakfast hours and the afternoon rides and the dinner bell. And Clara worked in the gallery and said nothing, and kept her hands moving, and did not allow herself to wonder what was being said in the rooms she was not in. On the second morning she passed the library door on her way to the gallery, and heard his voice inside, low and without effect. And then the dowager's voice, distinctly higher, and with a precision to it that Clara had learned to recognize as the precision of a woman choosing each word for the place it would land. The door was closed. She did not stop. Mrs. Tully found her that afternoon at her work table and sat down across from her, the way she sometimes did when she had something she wished to say and was deciding how to say it. "I heard Lady Dorothea speaking to Hobbs this morning," she said, "regarding your commission." She folded her hands. "She referred to you as the needlewoman who had overstepped." Clara set down her needle. Hobbs said nothing in reply. Mrs. Tully added. "He is not a man who argues." He looked, though, as though he had something to argue. The letter arrived the next afternoon. Mrs. Tully brought it to Clara's room with an expression that said she had not read it, but knew what it contained. Clara opened it at the small table by the window. It was from the Dowager's personal secretary. It informed Miss Vane, in 3 short sentences, that her services at Ashwick Manor were no longer required. The commission was terminated. The estate would provide 1 week's wages in lieu of notice. Any materials pertaining to the Ashwick embroideries were to be surrendered to the housekeeper before departure, and below that, in the Dowager's own hand, a brief addition. A needlewoman of her standing would do well to remember that the season has no appetite for those who overstep their commission. Mrs. Tully stood in the doorway. "She knows," Clara said. "She has always known," Mrs. Tully said. "The question is, what his lordship has now told her." Clara folded the letter. She thought about the traced paper in her work bag, beneath the needles. She had given the original underlayer document to Mrs. Tully the night before, rolled in oilcloth, with instructions that if anything should happen to Clara before she left, it should go to the solicitor Silas Crane, whose name and direction she had written on a card. She had found his name in the Chancery records at the village lending library, 3 weeks past. He was the solicitor for the living descendants of the Vane family. Her family. Her father's people. She had already written to him. She said nothing of this to Mrs. Tully. She packed her work bag with the care she gave everything she owned, folding the spare needles, capping the thread, tucking the traced paper in its inner pocket. When she lifted the bag, it weighed what it always had. Edmund came to her door that evening, 10 minutes before she meant to leave. He stood in the corridor, his face composed, his coat on, every inch the Earl of Ashwick, and she saw in his bearing the cost of the hours since the gallery, the decision he had made, and what it had required of him to make it. "I am told you are leaving," he said. "I have been told to leave," she said. A silence. The corridor was cold. A draft came from somewhere she could not locate, and her candle wavered. "The matter you discovered," he said. "The original embroidery. My mother has had it taken." "I know," Clara said. "Without it, there is nothing that can be proven." "I know that as well," she said. He looked at her then, a long look, the kind that had no social function and no deniability, the kind that simply saw, and she held it because she was done with looking away. "I am sorry," he said. It was a plain sentence. He did not qualify it. She picked up her bag. "I know that too," she said. She walked past him down the corridor, and he did not stop her. And the sound of her footsteps on the stone floor was the only sound in the wing. And it was a lonely sound, the kind that carries when everything else is silent. She went out through the back entrance into the November evening. The cold met her at the door, the particular cold of a November that has decided to be winter, whether the calendar agrees or not. And she pulled her coat closed and walked the path along the kitchen garden, past the bare earth where the herbs had been, past the low stone wall where she had sat once in October, with her lunch, because the day had been warm enough, and the light had been good. She did not look back at the house. She had known, in some part of herself, that she had not let the rest of herself examine too closely, that this was always the most likely outcome. A woman in her position, with a finding like hers, against a house like that one, with a dowager like that one, like that. The mathematics of it were not in her favor. She had known this from the moment she first unpicked the false overlay and saw the silver lark beneath. And she had proceeded anyway, not from naivety, but from a kind of bone-deep refusal to let the mathematics decide what she did. Her father had carried the same refusal, It had not saved him in the end. It had not brought him his earldom or his proof or his restoration. It had given him, she thought, a way of living inside the loss that was not the same as being defeated by it. She hoped he would have understood what she had done and why. She was 3 miles along the road to the village when Mr. Crane's carriage found her. He was a small, neat man with an accountant's precision and an advocate's patience, and he had received her letter and the original underlayer document, which Mrs. Tully had sent round to him by separate conveyance the same morning Clara's dismissal letter had arrived. He had, he told her, been waiting for something like this for 11 years. The legitimate Vane line had never ceased to exist. They had simply been poor and unable to prove what they were. She, a seamstress and a craftsman scholar's daughter with a tin chest full of heraldic rolls, had just proved it. She sat across from him in the carriage and looked out at the dark road and thought about what comes next when the thing you have done cannot be undone, and whether you were glad of it. She was. The dinner at Ashwick Manor 3 nights later was the Dowager's formal announcement of the understood engagement between the Earl of Ashwick and Miss Georgiana Peel. 26 people had been invited. The dining room was arranged with the family's best plate, the Ashwick crest engraved on the serving pieces, the gold falcon on red repeated across the table on every piece of silver the house owned. Mr. Silas Crane arrived at the front entrance at 7 in the evening with 2 documents and a quiet certainty that caused the footman to let him in without quite intending to. He sent his card in to the Earl directly, bypassing the Dowager entirely, and the Earl excused himself from the table for 11 minutes. And when he came back into the dining room, the table saw something in his face that none of them had seen before. He did not sit. He stood at the head of the table, in the way his father had stood and his grandfather before that, and he said to the assembled guests, in the even voice that had never in its life required a room to be quiet, and never had to ask for one, that he wished to make an announcement before the evening continued. The Dowager's fan paused. He announced that the formal documents pertaining to the legal claim of the Vane family against the Ashwick earldom had been received and examined, that they were in order, that he had no intention of contesting them. A sound moved through the table, not a gasp and not silence, the particular noise of a room reorganizing itself around a new fact. Miss Georgiana Peel looked at the Dowager with the cool precision of a woman calculating which direction the current had turned. The Dowager said in a voice like paper, "Edmund," and then, as though the single word had taken everything she had, "think of your father." "I am thinking of my father," he said. He said it quietly and without heat, which was worse, somehow, than anger would have been. "I have thought of little else for 7 years." He turned then and looked at the footman by the side door and said, "Will you ask Miss Vane to come in?" There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. She walked through the side door of the Ashwick dining room in the same dress she had worn 3 nights earlier, her work-bag over her arm, her hands clean, and the room turned to look at her the way rooms always turned to look at her, with the assessing collective gaze that had decided long ago what she was and had not yet been given cause to revise the verdict. The Dowager said very clearly, in a voice pitched to the room, "This is the needlewoman I dismissed for overstepping her commission. Whatever she has told Mr. Crane, it originates in professional grievance, and nothing more." A pause, the length of a breath drawn and held. Edmund Ashwick said, "Her word is the only one I trust in this house." The room was very still. He crossed from the head of the table to where Clara stood at the threshold, and his steps were measured and unhurried, as though he had all the time that had ever existed, and none of it required haste. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine work of his cravat and the set of his jaw, and he held out his hand. She looked at it for 1 moment. She had spent her life putting her hands to work, to service, to the careful undoing of other people's mistakes, and she had trained herself not to expect them to be held. The muscle memory of invisibility is a deep-seated thing, and it does not release easily. Then she put her hand in his. The dowager made a small sound that was not quite a word. She did not fragment into speech, not in front of the guests, because she was too well made for that. She set her fan down on the table. She looked at her son. She looked at Clara. Something moved across her face that was neither recognition nor contrition, but the precursor to both. The look of a woman whose entire life has operated by a script that has just run out of pages. Miss Georgiana Peel gathered her gloves from the table beside her with a composure Clara could not help but respect, and she said to no one in particular, "I believe the evening has concluded," and she left, and two of the other guests followed, and the room reformed itself around what remained. The legal proceeding took 4 months. Clara would remember it afterward in pieces, not as a continuous thing, but as a series of specific days. The day Mr. Crane laid the original underlayer document on the chancery table, and the registrar examined it for a very long time without speaking. The day the Herald's expert from the College of Arms arrived at Ashwick to examine the embroidery in person, the original piece retrieved from the dowager's locked dressing room where she had it placed, not destroyed, which was what Clara had believed she would do, and could not account for until Mrs. Tully said simply, she could not bring herself to destroy the original work. She is many things, but she is not a destroyer of beautiful things. Clara thought about that for a long time. The dowager remained at Ashwick through the proceedings, in the East Wing, in a silence that was not surrender but adjustment, the long, slow work of a person revising a life's scaffolding from the inside. She had commissioned the false overlay herself, Clara came to understand 30 years past, at her husband's instruction. And she had spent those 30 years building a life on the assumption that the original was buried deeply enough to stay buried. The discovery had not broken her. It had simply altered the ground she stood on, and she was old enough and capable enough to learn a new footing. However unwelcome the lesson, she did not speak to Clara again in those 4 months. At the proceedings' end, she came into the room where the final documents were being signed, and she stood at the edge. And when Clara looked up, Lady Dorothea met her gaze without looking away. There was no apology in it. Clara had not expected one. What was there was something more precise and harder won, a recognition, one careful and experienced person to another, that the work had been done correctly, and that the house, whatever it was called now, was on sounder footing for it. A woman who had spent her life building on a false foundation understanding, without words, that the woman who had found it was not her enemy. That was the only acknowledgement there was. It was enough. The earldom was formally surrendered to the Vane claim in February. Edmund ceased to hold the title. The estate, per the settlement, remained with the family through a separate entail that predated the original fraud and was not touched by the claim. He was still, by every material measure, the man he had been. He had simply ceased to be the man the false blazon had said he was. He was in the library when Clara came to tell him the deed was enrolled. She found him at the window with a book open on the table that he was clearly not reading. And he looked up when she entered and waited, with the patience of a man who has been waiting for some time. "It is done," she said. He nodded once. A pause. Clara. It was the first time he had used her name without the prefix, the given name alone, stripped of the formal title she had been assigned by her position, and it landed the way such things land, as a small and irrevocable gate opening. "I know," she said. "I know what it cost." "It was not mine," he said. "Whatever the cost of returning what was not mine, it is less than the cost of keeping it." She looked at the fire. "I did not come here," she said carefully, "to undo your family." "I know," he said. "You came to restore what had been damaged." A pause. "The embroidery is finished." "It is." "Then you have completed your commission." She looked at him then, steadily, the way she looked at difficult work that required her to see it whole before she could begin. "I have," she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that holds the next thing waiting inside it, patient as thread on a bobbin, and neither of them moved to break it too quickly. "I would like to offer you another commission," Edmund said. His voice was precisely level. "A different one." She did not answer immediately. "The house wants a deal of restoration," he said. "It has been maintained rather than cared for. There is a difference. I think you know the difference." "I do," she said. "I have no title to recommend the position," he said. He said it without self-pity, which was the only way she would have accepted it. "I am a seamstress," she said. "I did not come here for your title." He looked at her, for a long count, with the unsheltered quality that had been there at dawn in the gallery, that unarmored morning attention. And then he crossed the library to where she stood, and he offered her his hand the way he had offered it in the dining room, with the same unhurried certainty. She took it. His fingers closed around hers, and she felt the warmth of his hand through her own and let herself stand in the unfamiliar weight of being held by someone who had looked at her and then looked again, not past her, not through her, at her, and chosen to keep looking. "Clara Vane," he said. "Will you stay?" She thought of her father's tin chest, the heraldic rolls, the silver lark on blue. She thought of the traced paper she had made by candlelight, the proof she had kept beneath the needles. She thought of being 24 years old and knowing that what you carry is true, even when no one will hear it, and the particular discipline that asks of you. "Yes," she said. By spring, the West Wing had been opened for the first time in 8 years, and the windows let in a light that the rooms had not seen since before the current tenancy began. A particular April light, clear and without apology, that found every corner and left nothing in shadow. Mrs. Tully walked the rooms on the first morning they were open and stood in the center of the long sitting room with her hands clasped and said nothing for a moment, and then she went downstairs and told her second housemaid, in a tone that invited no further commentary, that the house was breathing differently now. The embroidery hung above the main staircase, fully restored, the false overlay gone, the silver lark on blue returned to the precise position and thread count it had occupied in its original making. To most visitors it was simply a family crest, old and handsome, and they gave it a glance and moved on. To Clara it was a record of every stitch placed, every thread released, every morning of careful work in the winter gallery. She passed it each morning on her way down to breakfast and did not stop. There was no need to stop. Edmund found her one evening in the small sitting room off the library, where she had taken to working in the later hours, a lamp lit against the lengthening dark. He came in without knocking, which had become their habit, and sat in the chair across from her, and did not speak for a few minutes, which had also become their habit. She was working a small piece, not a commission. Something for the house, a seat cushion in silk thread for the window bench in his study, the one whose upholstery had worn through at the corner where he always sat. He had not asked her to make it. She had seen the worn corner and thought she knew how to fix it. He noticed. He noticed everything. He sat across from her and watched her needle move and said nothing, which was not absence, but presence. After a while, she looked up. He was looking at her with the expression she had learned over the winter months. The one that was not love interest's ardor, because he was not a man given to ardor, but was something steadier and more enduring. The look of a man who has chosen a thing and found the choice correct and does not intend to revisit it. She reached into her work bag and took out the small folded square of original canvas, the piece she had freed from the underlayer on the first night of her discovery, the one the dowager had not thought to confiscate because she had not known it was there. It was perhaps 4 inches by 4. It showed the lark's wing and part of the field and the beginning of the motto, rendered in thread by some hand 100 years past, still bright. She set it on the arm of his chair. He looked at it for a moment. He picked it up. He held it as one holds something fragile and worth holding, with the flat of the palm, the fingers cupped but not gripping. "Keep it," she said. He looked up. "It is yours now," she said. "All of it." The lamp was burning low, and outside the window, the first evening of April was settling over the Ashwick grounds, and somewhere in the east wing, the clock chimed the hour, and the house held them both inside it, the repaired and the restored, and the work of keeping either was not yet done, and they both knew that, and neither of them minded. She went back to her needle. He kept the lark in his coat pocket. From that evening forward. She knew because she sewed the pocket back into his winter coat in November when the lining had frayed, and she found the small square folded inside, and she held it in her palm for one moment and then put it back and finished the seam and said nothing. Some things do not need to be said. They had stitched enough between them.